On London Plus tonight, the story of how the capital's drug barons are turning over £200 million a year. How some are so sophisticated that they do their own market research and have their own legal departments. How can they be stopped? Join us later.
On BBC2 now, the inscrutable detective Charlie Chan has his secret revealed. This is BBC1.
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Sue Lawley and Andrew Harvey.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. President Reagan has tonight made his most conciliatory speech so far on arms control. At the United Nations, he offered a new deal with the Russians on Star Wars and on cutting nuclear weapons. But he warned that the Danilov affair continues to cloud relations. David Owen has told the Liberals he is committed to arms control, but only with a strong defence policy. The drugs epidemic, the police say it's now worth more than £500 million a year in Britain to the traffickers. Black trade unionists in South Africa have disrupted a memorial service for the victims of last week's mining disaster. And the world's youngest heart and lung transplant patient. He's just 2.5 months old. The ice of the negotiating stalemate between East and West could break. That was the theme of an important speech made by President Reagan today. He adopted a tone of unexpected optimism and conciliation as he made public his latest proposals for arms reductions in a speech to the United Nations General Assembly. He's shown that he is willing to strike a compromise deal on Star Wars, the space weapons policy to which he is dedicated and the Soviet Union deeply opposed. Mr. Reagan says he would be willing to sign a deal tomorrow to delay the deployment of the Strategic Defence Initiative for 7 years at least. And he proposes that if either side deploys SDI, it should immediately share its technology and benefits. Officials say the President had reviewed his speech in the last few days to ensure that its tone was not nasty, as they put it. But at the same time, he continued to criticise the Soviets' attitude over the Danilov affair and their violations of human rights. From New York, Martin Bell reports.
It's a day unlike any other in the UN calendar. The ideal of beating swords into plowshares was quoted by the President in his speech. But on the roof of the General Assembly, sharpshooters were preparing to defend him if need be. When he comes visiting here, his security guards are especially nervous. He himself seemed strangely lost for a man who'd been there 4 times before. But finally, he found his way to the first meeting with the King and Queen of Spain. But Mr. Reagan's main business was his annual address to the United Nations. It had been revised by his staff since he received a letter from Mr. Gorbachev last Friday, and it was the most positive and hopeful that he's made here yet, except for the Danilov affair, which he said cast a pall over US-Soviet relations.
Gennady Zakharov is an accused spy who would stand trial. Nicholas Danilov is an innocent hostage who should be released. The Soviet Union bears the responsibility for the consequences of its action. Misusing the United Nations for purposes of espionage does a grave disservice to this organization. And the world expects better.
But on arms control, he spoke as if agreement were in sight to reduce long-range missiles and eliminate medium-range missiles altogether.
The ice of the negotiating stalemate could break if both sides intensify their effort in the new round of Geneva talks and if we keep the promises we made to each other last November.
It's a 2-track approach, and the problem with it is that the 2 tracks cross each other. The Americans are continuing to chastise the Russians for holding Danilov, yet at the same time they're pressing for a summit and the last chance of a major arms control agreement in the whole of the Reagan presidency. He finished today to polite applause in which Mr. Shevardnadze did not join. The Russians deliver their reply tomorrow. Again, under a heavy protective cordon, Mr. Reagan left to brief the Allies on a superpower relationship that is changing. There's movement on arms control. The Soviet diplomats ordered out of the country left New York last night. Only the deadlock remains on the Danilov case, and until that's resolved, there will be no summit. This is Martin Bell for the 6 o'clock news at the United Nations.
David Owen, the leader of the Social Democrats, set out this afternoon to heal the rift in the alliance, to prove that he and the Liberals were on the same wavelength on the issue of defence. He was making one of the first speeches at this year's Liberal Assembly in Eastbourne, and in what's being seen as a skillful address, he sought to win over his Liberal critics and show them that he was as committed to nuclear disarmament as they were. But he was at pains to tell them that you couldn't negotiate on disarmament if you didn't have a strong defence. You couldn't, as it were, go naked into the conference chamber. Dr. Owen spent more than half of his 30-minute speech on the technicalities of defence. He said what had been lacking in Britain for some time was a government committed to arms control as strongly as to defence, a gap he believes the alliance can fill. Well, whether the SDP leader has made any impression on the Liberal disarmers won't be known until tomorrow when the party debates defence. But for tonight, as David Coss reports, his supporters are hoping the doctor, if he hasn't provided a cure, may have prescribed the right medicine.
Mr. Steele arrived at Eastbourne having already nailed his colours to the mast. He believes Britain should keep its nuclear deterrent until and unless it can be negotiated away. When he arrived with his wife, that was the message Dr. Owen brought too.